Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Alina Vance sat 2 chairs down from Lieutenant Marcus Hayward, the SEAL officer whose confidence filled every corner of the operations tent. He spoke fast, sharp, every word aimed at the whiteboard like a bullet. Around him, the room buzzed with low laughter, coded slang, and that particular rhythm of men who believed they already owned the outcome. And yet, she could feel the space between them, the quiet, deliberate isolation that always seemed to follow her into these rooms. National Guard attachment, someone muttered near the coffee urn. Weekend warrior. They didn't whisper it, they didn't need to. Alina kept her gaze fixed on the mission map. West Virginia's Mananga National Forest sprawled across it in a mess of green contour lines and river veins. Their orders were simple: a multi-unit navigation exercise, small team coordination, live fire drills. Routine. But the way Hayward's voice cut through the noise told her this was more than a simple training run. He wanted to prove something, to his team, maybe to himself, and she was an inconvenience in that narrative. He never looked at her when he spoke, not once. When the meeting ended, the men filed out with practiced ease, checking weapons and radios, the smell of oil and caffeine blending with the damp morning air. Alina rose silently, collected her sniper rifle case, and stepped into the gray dawn. That was when Hayward said it. Stay back with the vehicles while real operators handle this. It wasn't loud, it didn't have to be. The sentence landed like a slap, then hung in the air between them. She gave no answer, just the faintest nod before walking away. But inside, something tightened. A familiar weight. Years of proving herself in rooms where her silence was mistaken for weakness, where competence was invisible until blood made it obvious. Hours later, she watched Hayward's SEAL team pinned down in the forest valley below, the sound of gunfire rolling up the hills like thunder. This was supposed to be training. Instead, it had become an ambush. Through her scope, the scene unfolded with brutal clarity. 4 men, caught in a crossfire, diving for cover behind a fallen oak as bullets tore through ferns and bark. AK-pattern rifles cracked from multiple angles. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a PKM machine gun hammered out bursts that chewed up the ground around them. Alina adjusted the magnification, her breathing calm, her heartbeat matching the rhythm of the trigger guard beneath her finger. The M110 felt like an extension of her pulse, steady, certain. She'd set up 700 meters above the valley, a vantage she'd chosen not for comfort, but for control. And control was the only thing she had right now. She keyed her mic twice, a click code warning Hayward had dismissed earlier that morning. Now it echoed like prophecy. She'd seen the signs hours ago: disturbed soil along the ridgeline, boot prints where only deer should have left tracks, and the strangest detail of all, silence. No birds, no movement. The forest had been holding its breath long before the shooting started. He hadn't listened, none of them had. Her first target moved between trees, civilian clothes but posture all wrong. Professional. The kind of man who cleared corners even in open space. She centered the reticle just below the collarbone, exhaled once and pressed the trigger. The rifle spoke with a muffled crack. The man dropped instantly. Before his body hit the dirt, her crosshairs found another, and another. The rhythm came back to her like prayer. Breathe, acquire, press, follow through. Her grandfather's voice echoed in memory. Breathe like the mountain breathes. Samuel Vance's hands guiding her small fingers on the wooden stock of an old Remington 700. She'd been 8 years old, the recoil nearly knocking her off balance. He'd laughed softly, not unkindly. Slow and steady, he'd said, same as the earth beneath you. She could still feel that weight, the recoil, the lesson, the quiet pride in his eyes. Back then, she didn't know he'd been a Marine Scout sniper in Vietnam, or that he'd later worked in shadows for agencies that never sent thank you notes. All she knew was that he carried a loneliness that never left him, and that when he taught her to shoot, it wasn't about killing. It was about control. Because the world isn't always kind to people who can't protect themselves, he'd told her once. Sometimes the best protection is being so good that nobody dares ignore you. And that line, that single truth, had carried her through everything that followed. Her mother's death from cancer, her father's injury in Iraq, the endless skepticism that greeted her every time she wore a uniform. Another target appeared through the brush. Her next shot landed squarely. The man fell sideways, the sound lost beneath the roar of the PKM. Hayward's team scrambled behind the log, returning fire in disciplined bursts. They were good, trained, but they were outnumbered and trapped in a kill zone. Elena toggled the mic. Overwatch to recon actual. I have multiple hostiles flanking your 3 and 9 o'clock. Recommend immediate displacement north, Rattlesnake Gap. Static, then Hayward's voice, clipped and disbelieving. Overwatch, who authorized you to leave your position? Never left it, sir, she said evenly. You walked into an ambush 700 meters below me. A pause, long enough for him to understand how bad things had become. Copy Overwatch, he said finally, the arrogance gone. Hostiles on our 3 are keeping us pinned. Can you engage? She didn't answer, the rifle did. 2 quick shots. The PKM gunner slumped forward across his weapon, his assistant sliding down beside him. The echo faded, replaced by the shouts of confusion from the remaining fighters. 3 o'clock threat neutralized, she transmitted. Move now while they reposition. This time, Hayward didn't hesitate. The SEAL team executed a textbook withdrawal, Stone and Bennett laying suppressive fire while Martinez and Park dragged a wounded teammate toward higher ground. But even from above, Elena could see the trap waiting ahead. Another ambush line, perfectly placed along their escape route. She swiveled her scope toward a rusted propane tank beside an old hunting cabin. 1 round. Centermass hit. The explosion tore through the tree line, a fireball rolling up the ridge. Not lethal at that distance, but loud enough to make every enemy head turn. Recon actual hard left. Move west toward the fire, then north behind it. You've got 30 seconds before they reacquire. No hesitation this time. The team obeyed. Smoke and confusion gave them cover as they broke contact. Elena tracked them, firing precision shots at militia fighters trying to recover the line. Within 2 minutes, the SEALs were gone, vanished into terrain she knew like her own breath. The same ground she'd hunted with her grandfather. The same valleys she'd walked during her father's long rehab hikes, when every step had been both pain and defiance. Now her radio came alive again. Overwatch, we're at the rally point, Hayward said, breath rough but steady. Status. Hostiles regrouping near initial contact. Recommend movement toward fire tower for extraction. I'll displace to re-establish Overwatch. Negative, Hayward said, voice shifting, respect beginning to thread through command. Hold position, we're coming to you, time to consolidate. That simple sentence, we're coming to you, carried something she hadn't expected, trust. She scanned the valley as the team began their climb. Her scope caught movement, one figure different from the rest. Uniformed, disciplined, giving orders. She zoomed in and froze. Vincent Kruger. Her stomach turned to stone. The name had lived in her family's silence for decades. Timber Ridge, 1998. She'd been 11, sitting in Grace's diner with her grandfather when a stranger walked in. The tension had been instant, palpable, heavy. You destroyed my career, the man had hissed. Her grandfather had answered quietly. You destroyed your own. Then the sheriff had escorted Kruger out and nobody spoke of it again. Years later, Elena learned the truth. Kruger, once a decorated Green Beret, had been dishonorably discharged for war crimes in Central America, executing prisoners, civilians, the kinds of acts soldiers weren't supposed to survive afterward. And it had been Samuel Vance's testimony that sealed his fate. Now, decades later, Kruger was back, and he'd brought his grudge with him. Elena keyed the mic. Recon Actual Overwatch. Hostile Commander Identified. Vincent Kruger, former SF, Dishonorable Discharge 97. This ambush isn't random, it's targeted. Targeted? Hayward's voice tightened. Explain. My grandfather testified in his court-martial. He wants revenge. You were the bait. The silence that followed was colder than the mountain wind. 15 minutes later, the SEAL team reached her position. Hayward climbed the ridge, his eyes scanning the setup, the field of fire, the concealment. Professional appreciation replaced earlier arrogance. Staff Sergeant Vance, he said formally, we need to talk about what we're dealing with. She briefed them fast. Kruger's background, the family connection, the likelihood of a deeper trap. Stone listened carefully, arms folded, expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to respect. So we walked into a trap meant for you, he said quietly. Which means this isn't over, Alina replied. Before Hayward could answer, the emergency channel crackled alive. A voice, rough, calm, filled with venom. Alina Vance, your grandfather took everything from me, my career, my future. Now I'm going to take everything from you, starting with the men you're trying to protect. Come down here and face me, or I start hunting them, one by one. The transmission ended. The forest went silent again, as if even the wind was waiting to hear her answer. Hayward looked at her. Guess we know his contingency plan. Alina stared through the valley fog, her jaw tightening. Every instinct screamed for restraint. Kruger was baiting her, trying to make it personal. But her grandfather's voice returned again. Never give the enemy what he wants just because he demands it. She turned back toward the team. We don't play his game. He wants me to come down alone. That means he's not as confident as he sounds. If he had the upper hand, he'd already be attacking. For the first time, Hayward nodded, conceding the logic. So what's our move? We make him think he's getting what he wants while we do the opposite, Alina said, pulling a worn map from her chest pouch. Fire Lookout Tower on Blackwater Ridge. 3 clicks northeast. Single access route, defensible and clear landing zone for extract. 3 clicks with a wounded man, Martinez asked. Through terrain they don't know like I do, she countered. Old fire roads long abandoned. They'll expect us to stay low. We take the high ground. Stone leaned over the map, tracing routes with a finger. And pursuit. That's where I come in, Alina said quietly. Rear security. I'll stay behind. Every time they move, I'll slow them down. You'll be alone, Hayward said. Concern, real concern, colored his tone. With respect, sir, she replied, chambering around. That's what I was trained for. He studied her a long moment, then nodded. All right, you keep them off our backs, but Vance, he met her eyes. You stay alive, that's an order. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Understood, sir. When they moved out 5 minutes later, she stayed behind, watching them disappear into the green shadows below. The forest swallowed their shapes, leaving only the whisper of leaves and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Alina adjusted her position, the rifle heavy against her shoulder, the valley stretching silent beneath her. Somewhere out there, Vincent Kruger waited, an old ghost of her family's past resurrected in the smoke and the trees. And she whispered, more to herself than to the mountain air. Grandpa, it looks like your war isn't over yet. What makes a person step toward danger when every instinct says run? Alina asked herself that as she shifted her rifle, scanning the forest through the fading light. The men she was protecting were already half a kilometer ahead, moving toward the fire tower she'd marked on her map. Their radio pings came in short bursts, disciplined, efficient, almost comforting in their rhythm. They trusted her now. That was new. And terrifying. Trust came with weight. If she failed, it wasn't just her own life at risk anymore. Her scope tracked 2 figures creeping through the undergrowth below, silhouettes cutting across the dying amber glow of sunset. They moved low and cautious, rifles raised. Hunters. She waited until they were halfway through the narrow choke point between two boulders, then exhaled slowly. The first shot broke clean. The man dropped before sound caught up. His partner froze, scanning wildly, searching for an enemy he couldn't see. The second round ended his confusion. She keyed her mic. Overwatch to recon actual. 2 hostiles down on your back trail. They're tracking but poorly. Maintain pace and heading. Copy that, Overwatch, Hayward's voice replied, breathing heavy but steady. Approaching first waypoint. Any change in posture? Negative, Alina said, watching shapes move below. They're spooked. They think the devil's on their heels. Stone's voice cut in. Let's keep them thinking that. Alina almost smiled. She moved parallel to the SEAL team's route, keeping elevation advantage as she advanced through the darkening forest. Every sound mattered now, the whisper of leaves, the subtle crack of distant movement. To an untrained ear, the woods were chaos. To Alina, they were language. The forest told stories if you learned how to listen. She'd spent her teenage years walking these same slopes with her father, Carter Vance, the man who refused to surrender even when his body betrayed him. After Iraq, he'd come home half the man he'd been physically, but twice the fighter. Every morning he climbed these ridges, dragging a damaged leg and a limp arm toward the sky. She remembered one morning in particular. She was 16, trailing behind him, watching him struggle up a steep incline. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked. "You know you won't get better." He stopped, sweat pouring down his face. "The day I stopped trying," he'd said, "is the day I let the injury win. I didn't survive Fallujah to lose to my own body." Then he kept climbing. At the top, he'd looked out over the valley, the same valley she now defended, and told her, "Your grandfather taught you how to aim. I'll teach you how to endure. Because someday, skill won't be enough. The only thing that'll get you through is refusing to quit." Now, with the mountain wind pressing cold against her cheeks, she understood what he'd meant. She was tired. Her arms ached from holding the rifle steady. Her back burned under the weight of her pack, but she kept moving. "Stay unpredictable," her grandfather's voice whispered in memory. "The moment they think they understand your pattern, you change it." Ahead, movement flickered again, 5 shapes this time. They were setting up along a narrow pass the SEAL team would have to cross. Perfect ambush ground. Alina crouched low, setting her scope to 10x magnification. The range was long, 600 meters downhill. She adjusted for the angle, factoring wind, gravity, temperature. Her brain did the math automatically, the numbers becoming instinct. The first shot took the man perched highest on the rocks, spotter or leader, judging by his positioning. He fell backward without a sound. The second target carried something bulkier, an RPG. That one couldn't be allowed to fire. Alina's second shot shattered his chest before he even knew he'd been seen. The others broke formation, diving for cover. She took a third while he was still mid-motion. The remaining 2 vanished behind boulders, but it didn't matter. The ambush was broken. "Overwatch to recon actual," she said, breath even. "Ambush ahead neutralized. Route is clear, but proceed with caution." "Understood," Hayward replied. "Your position compromised." "Possibly. Relocating now." She slung the rifle and moved fast, staying close to the ground, navigating by muscle memory. She knew these woods like others knew city streets. The path shifted beneath her boots, moss, pine needles, soft earth. Every sound she made was measured, intentional. Voices drifted up from below. 2 men, close. She froze, lowering herself into the ferns. "She's got to be on this ridge somewhere," one said, his tone sharp with nerves. "Nobody makes those shots from the valley floor." "Kruger wants her alive," the other replied. "Says she's worth more breathing." Alina's pulse slowed. Alive? Why? Revenge didn't need witnesses. That meant Kruger had another plan, a bigger one. She stayed perfectly still as they passed within 20 meters, the camouflage of her ghillie suit blending seamlessly into the forest floor. The trick wasn't hiding, it was becoming part of the terrain. Her grandfather had drilled that into her during long hours of deer hunting in these same hills. Stillness, he'd said. It's not absence of movement, it's command of it. When the searchers vanished, she exhaled softly and resumed her climb, angling toward a new vantage point. Below, the SEAL team crossed the cleared path, moving with increased caution. She watched their formation, noting how they covered sectors, how they adapted to terrain. Professional, efficient, and finally respectful. It hadn't been that way at first. She remembered the jokes, the quiet skepticism. A woman in a sniper's nest, National Guard. But respect, she knew, wasn't demanded, it was earned. One bullet at a time, one decision that saved lives instead of taking them. The memory of Ranger School surfaced, her first crucible. 3 women in a class of 250. From the first day, they'd been tested twice as hard and believed half as capable. "You don't belong here," one candidate had sneered during the first week. "You'll get someone killed." Alina hadn't answered. She just beat him at everything that mattered: navigation, marksmanship, leadership. By the time they reached Mountain Phase, his mockery had turned into silence. But the moment that had truly marked her came later, when she sat exhausted and filthy, alone after a 48-hour patrol. Master Sergeant Owen Hayes had sat down beside her, the kind of quiet mentor soldiers rarely notice until too late. "You know the hardest part of your job?" he'd asked. "It's not the physical part. It's knowing you'll have to be twice as good to be seen as half as competent, that every mistake will be blamed on your gender and every success called luck." She looked at him, raw and tired. "Then why do it?" "Because someone has to be first," he'd said. "Your grandfather fought the wars the old way. You're fighting a different kind, the one inside the system. Kick the door open so others don't have to." The words echoed now as she crawled into her new overwatch position, sweat chilling against her neck. She wasn't here to prove anything anymore. She was here because people would die if she didn't do her job. "Overwatch Recon Actual," Hayward's voice came through again. "We're through the pass, approaching waypoint 2. "Copy," Alina said, scanning the horizon. "I've got search teams in the valley. Recommend increased pace. Time's a factor." "Can you buy us time?" he asked. Alina didn't hesitate. Affirmative, creating diversion. She slid down the slope, moving toward the old hunter's cabin she'd marked earlier. When she reached it, the air smelled of propane and dust. The tank sat behind the structure, half hidden by vines. She sighted in, placed one clean shot through the valve, and the explosion ripped through the woods, orange and red and deafening. Flames reached for the treetops, throwing shadows across the valley. She didn't wait to admire the effect. She moved fast, flanking left to a secondary position where she could engage the inevitable response. 3 minutes later they came, 5 militia fighters, their faces lit by the fire's glow. They were shouting, disorganized, focused on the blaze instead of the forest around them. Alina let them cluster. Then she began her work. 1, 2, 3. The last 2 survivors dived for cover, one shouting into his radio. She relocated before they could triangulate her position. "Overwatch to Recon Actual," she said, breath steady despite the adrenaline. "Diversion successful. Multiple hostiles diverted. You've got clear movement for 30 minutes. Hayward's laugh came through the static. "We owe you a beer when this is over." "I'll hold you to that, sir," she said, and despite the chaos, she found herself smiling. The sun had dipped behind the ridgeline, turning everything copper and shadow. The forest smelled of smoke and pine sap. Somewhere to the west, Kruger was recalculating, shifting his pieces on the board. And then, right on cue, his voice slithered through the emergency frequency again. "Alina Vance," he said softly, almost conversational. "Impressive. Your grandfather would have been proud, but you're making this harder than it needs to be. I've got 40 men in these mountains. You're one woman, do the math." She didn't answer. "I know what you're planning," he continued. You'll get your SEAL friends to that tower, call in a bird and fly away, but I've got eyes on every landing zone. You bring a helicopter in here, my people will turn it into confetti. How many pilots are you willing to kill for your pride? His words were smooth, practiced. Psychological warfare straight out of the handbook. She said nothing. Silence was power. Kruger's tone softened, like a predator pretending mercy. You surrender, I let them walk. You have my word. The radio clicked quiet, a liar's promise hanging in static. Then Hayward's voice broke in, sharp and low. Tell me you're not considering that. Not for a second, she said. But he's right about one thing. If he's got anti-air, we can't risk a normal extract. Alternatives? Stone asked. Alina studied her map, the terrain etched into her mind. We still go to the tower, but we don't call for pickup yet. We hold overnight, make him think we're waiting for help. Meanwhile, I locate and disable his air defenses. That's suicide, Martinez said. Maybe, she replied, but it's also the only way we all get out alive. The radio went quiet for several beats. Then Hayward spoke softly. I'm not ordering you to do this. I know, she said. I'm volunteering. Another pause, the sound of a man weighing duty against conscience. Understood, he said finally. We'll hold the tower, but Vance. His tone softened. You come back, that's not an order, it's a request. She smiled faintly, unseen in the dark. Copy that, sir. For the next hour, she shadowed their movement, keeping one eye on Kruger's regrouping militia. They were slower now, cautious. Fear had crept in. The woman with the silent rifle had become a ghost story whispered between them. By dusk, the SEAL team reached the tower, an old steel structure clawing at the sky, surrounded by mist. One way up, one way down, defensible, perfect. Overwatch position secure, Hayward reported. Good visibility, enough ammo to hold for days. Copy, Alina said, checking her gear. I'm beginning reconnaissance for air defenses. If you don't hear from me by 200, assume mission failure. Proceed with alternate extraction. Negative, Stone cut in. You've got until 400. If we don't hear from you, we're coming for you. Alina's chest tightened. 6 hours ago, they'd laughed at her. Now, they were willing to risk their lives for her. That was respect, the kind earned in silence, paid for in blood and trust. She turned toward the valley, tightening her straps, her rifle slung across her back. Darkness rolled down the mountain like smoke. Vincent Kruger was waiting somewhere out there, and she intended to find him first. As she descended into the night, the forest swallowed her whole. Her last whisper before she disappeared was calm, quiet, and absolute. Grandpa, I'm not running from his war anymore. I'm finishing it. What do you risk when you choose to move into the dark alone? Alina paused at the edge of the mill road and let the night swallow her. The black heart of the timber mill lay below, its rusted skeleton a silhouette against a sky full of stars. Flames still licked at the hunter's cabin ridge, distant, distracting, useful. The smell of smoke hung in the valley like a promise and a lie. Kruger's men were scrambling to respond to the blaze. That was the point. Distraction bought time, but time was a double-edged thing. It could save lives or it could seal a trap tighter. Alina had to thread that needle without a seam. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold. The M110 was heavy against her shoulder, but she carried it like a memory. Not a talisman, not a charm, but a tool whose purpose she respected. She moved low through the underbrush, night vision monocular clamped to one eye like an additional sense. The forest in infrared was a map of heat and motion, men blotted as dark shapes, coals where fires burned, the faint warmth of engines and bodies. She navigated hours of experience, every step measured, every twig avoided with the patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning how to be invisible. She planned this infiltration in fragments and instincts, relying on lessons from her father and the precise training her grandfather had enforced until her hands knew the shape of a trigger before her mind did. Now those lessons braided into something new, risk weighed against utility, fear translated into motion. When she first spotted the missile cache, four camo-netted forms beneath the torn roof of an old warehouse, her stomach clenched. Igla systems. Man-portable, lethal to any approach. Kruger hadn't been bluffing. He told her he had anti-air. He meant it. And those weapons were the single most immediate barrier between a scared team on a tower and a safe airlift home. She could burn the launchers with an explosive, but that would scream to the camp and send Kruger into a frenzy, hammering every trail toward Timber Ridge like a hound. She needed a surgical fix, a way to remove their teeth without announcing to the pack she'd been there. She circled the perimeter, hands moving with quiet precision, and found the thermal battery racks half exposed beneath a tarp. Small, replaceable, but essential. Remove them, and the launcher would seem whole until someone tried to use it. She could do this, but it would mean moving within feet of sentries in a compound where the margin for error was zero. Two guards rotated near the cache, voices low, equipment clinking. Alina counted three, then two, timing their steps like a metronome. When the younger sentry blinked, the older leaned too far into conversation, and Alina was already sliding behind a rusted beam. Her hands were steady as she reached the first launcher, thumb finding the battery release with familiarity that felt almost like theft. One by one, she removed the thermal cells and tucked them into her pack, the cool metal heavy and ominous. It was done before most could even register the absence. Then the mill exploded with light as her sabotaged fuel tank hit. A sound like a giant's fist slammed the night. Shouts, running boots, men clearing toward the fire. Alina slid away, holding nothing but a small package of stolen power, proof that she'd taken the teeth from a beast. She finished the easy part. Now came the worst. Kruger would adapt. He would not accept failure. He would pivot to contingency, and contingency meant hostages. The whispered mention of Sheriff Mitchell and Timber Ridge hung in her mind like smoke. If Kruger decided to drag the town into the fight, this would become something ugly and personal, and she would be the fulcrum. She sought the higher ground where the trees thinned and the stars watched like indifferent witnesses. From there she accessed the tactical frequency, fingers moving with practiced speed, encryption cycling through at the press of a button. Recon actual overwatch, air defenses neutralized, thermal batteries removed from 4 Igla systems. I need to transmit a warning, possible hostage contingency in Timber Ridge. Kruger mentioned sheriff cooperation. Static, then Hayward's voice grave and exhausted. Copy overwatch. We have confirmation. Major Sullivan pushed a warning to the FBI before comms were jammed. They're en route, ETA 6 hours. We can't rely on immediate federal response. 6 hours was a long time to keep a town from panic. It was an eternity in tactical minutes. Alina clenched her jaw. The thought of Grace Thompson, the diner woman who'd patched her pie and held a place for her when the world felt too large, pinned something raw in her chest. The idea of Kruger's hand reaching into that small sphere of ordinary love set her teeth on edge. She chose action. Timber Ridge slept under a thin scattering of porch lights and the occasional glow of television screens. Alina slid into alleys, scaled fences, and knocked on doors with the quiet, practiced rhythm of someone who grew up avoiding attention. She moved like the town remembered, like a daughter of the valley who belonged to these streets and to the people who'd raised her, but who had also walked away to wear other uniforms. Those two lives braided in her every move. Tommy Miller's hardware store smelled of oil and old wood when she slipped inside. Tommy, a man whose hands had seen too many winters and too many repairs, greeted her without surprise, as if he'd known she'd come. He fed her coffee like it might keep the night from catching her breath. She told him what she needed and he understood in the way small-town veterans do. Practical, no drama, eyes on the job. They woke what could be trusted, veterans who'd returned from deserts and hills far from their home, but had never stopped keeping watch. Men in their 70s who still moved like soldiers when the call came. Kids 3 years out of combat with eyes that knew how to watch for the unnatural in the dark. They took rifles down from walls, loaded them with hands that trembled from the cold but steadied with certainty. Within an hour, the town's skeleton crew of defenders took positions at the diner, the church, the school. Grace refused to evacuate. The woman's stubbornness was part resolve, part gentle need to keep feeding people who might need food when bullets found their way through windows. Alina briefed them in whispers, each instruction a small stone that would hold weight later. Evacuation routes south toward Charleston for those who wanted out. Defensive positions for those who stayed. Rules of engagement that matched the moral lines she wouldn't cross. No summary executions, no vengeance, no turning the town into a battlefield. These were ordinary people, not soldiers. The lines she drew were both protection and promise. Tommy looked at her at one point and said, "You're doing too much alone." "You taught me to do what needed doing," she answered, thinking of her father and her grandfather, of the mantra that always returned when fear tried to overtake action. Do the next right thing. He nodded, his face a weathered map of commendations and years. "We'll hold the line." She left Timber Ridge with a pocket full of promises and a heart that felt oddly lighter for having asked for help. No warrior stands truly alone. Even the loneliest operatives rely on community in the end. She moved back uphill during the first sheets of rain, the forest dampening sound, and adding a sheen to stone and leaf. Rain blurred the edges of the world and wrapped it in a kind of mercy. As she approached the mill again, the night erupted, voices, orders, bootfalls. Kruger's men were rearranging themselves, consolidating, cross-checking. An army pushed to its edge. A radio call hissed through in a language she peripherally recognized as mapping and movement. "Sweep here. Check the western line." Someone barked orders about a convoy moving toward Timber Ridge. She slipped into shadow and watched as forms moved like chess pieces, a command figure packing, others flanking as if rehearsing a theater of violence. Kruger himself remained unseen but for the brief moments when a silhouette stepped into light and barked into a handset. He was always a few steps removed, the conductor, never the first violin. Then a small storm in her mind. Dalton Reed, the lieutenant she'd fought earlier, sat at the edge of the camp with his jaw tight and eyes like coals. He had authority. When he noticed absence, battery racks missing, his face curdled into anger and then into method. Reed didn't talk much. He made men move. Alina watched Reed approach 2 sentries, whisper a command, and then sweep with a team in her direction. She had minutes, perhaps even less. She crawled along an embankment until she was above a small drainage, an old sluice that funneled rainwater under the mill road. It was deep enough to be a choke point. If Reed's team passed through without clearing, she could hold them there, but that would also reveal her presence. She weighed the options: engage and risk compromising the whole operation, or avoid conflict and let them pass, possibly toward Timber Ridge. Neither seemed palatable. But she'd never asked for choices to be easy. She'd only asked for them to be clear. When they came, Reed's team moved in perfect silence, the kind drilled into them when discipline mattered most. Alina picked them off one by one, not from a distance this time, but close, surgical. A suppressed pistol did the work at first, 2 precise shots that folded men into shadow. She used their own momentum against them, jerking their bodies into positions that looked like natural deaths when found. She knew how Kruger's men would respond: a cordon, a sweep, but also a reluctance to risk more losses if the cost seemed high. Fear muddies resolve, and fear was an ally she could use without lying to herself about what it meant. One man managed to sound an alert. The night split. Men began scanning with flashlights, the beams stabbing into trees like desperate hands. Alina moved like a ghost, shifting position, letting the light reach emptiness while she melted into cover. Reed's anger came like a thunderclap, a shout, a command, then boots. He cursed and called for numbers. Alina listened and counted. He was mobilizing too many men toward the mill, exactly the mistake she wanted them to make. She backed away, climbed to a ridge, and keyed her radio. Recon actual, overwatch. Small sweep approaching from the northwest. I engaged. They're funneling men toward the mill. Recommend immediate lockdown and prepare for possible diversionary push toward Timber Ridge. Copy, Hayward said. We see them shifting. Hold your position. The next minutes were a study in small choices sewn into a greater tapestry. Alina watched as Kruger's men split. Some pushed toward Timber Ridge, some hammered the mill. The redistribution of force gave her the edge. Fewer guns aimed at the fire tower, more at the path toward town. That was the opening she needed. Kruger would try to bribe fear into compliance, threats, hostage-taking, leverage. She buried his first line of defense. Now he was burning through his options. And through it all, something else braided into the night. A small, stubborn moral clarity. They could have burned Timber Ridge down, taken the lives of old friends and neighbors to prove a point. They could have forced Alina's hand and turned a mountain into a funeral pyre. Instead, there was a split, an opportunity, a chance to turn the hunter into the hunted. She moved like a practiced predator, not because she wanted to kill, but because the only way to protect the lives she'd already promised to keep was to be willing to unmake the tools of violence when they threatened innocence. She cataloged the ethics of every shot, weighing the cost of silence against the surety of death if she failed. At 3 in the morning, while rain hammered the canopies and the smell of wet bark and diesel braided into one, Alina found a small moment to rest. She sat on a boulder and let the world exhale. Her hands trembled, not from fatigue, but from the weight of everything she'd asked herself to carry. She thought of her grandfather's rough palm on her shoulder years ago when she'd first learned to take a long-range shot. "The rifle won't define you," he'd said, voice soft with age. "You define the shot." Tonight, she felt that definition press against her ribs. The radio clicked haltingly, then came Hayward's voice, breathless and for once honest. "Vance, Timber Ridge reports hold. No civilians harmed. You did good down there." Her throat tightened. Pride rose, not the arrogant kind but the small kind that's knotted with gratitude and fear both. "Copy," she answered. "Hold the tower. I'm moving to intercept a convoy trying to push south." "Be careful," Stone said, like a father who felt the chill of night from miles away. "I will," she said, though she couldn't promise it. Alina stood, slinging the rifle back onto her shoulder, and disappeared into the rain-thin dark, because there were roads to block, people to warn, and a living town that needed her more than the world needed to see who paid for it. If she failed, the cost would be the faces of those she loved. If she succeeded, she'd add another line to a ledger she never intended to keep. Either way, she moved forward. Why did he think burning a town would make him whole? Rain turned the dirt roads into ribbons of glass as Alina moved downhill, each step calculated so the sound of her boots never outran her thoughts. The convoy she tracked earlier, 2 pickups and a flatbed, headlights slicing through the night, was the kind of muscle Kruger sent when he wanted to show force, not finesse. They weren't the elite scouts. They were the men who arrived after a plan needed muscle. That meant they were dangerous in numbers and sloppy individually, perfect for distraction. Dangerous for anyone caught in the open. She positioned herself on a low rise above the road, the M4 steady in her hands because speed would matter more than the long, slow breath that marked her sniper shots. Up close, things were different. Fast, fluid, less room for calculation and more room for instinct. She trained for this too, the long-range geometry of the ridge and the sudden, sweaty panic of a close ambush. Her grandfather had taught her both. Her father had taught her to keep moving when the body told her otherwise. Tonight she would use both lessons. The first truck came into view, a boxy silhouette rolling slow as the driver checked the road. 2 men on the flatbed scanned the tree line with flashlights, their beams cutting the dark and giving away more than they found. Alina waited until the lead vehicle reached the choke point, then moved with a speed that belonged to the young woman who had once outrun her exhaustion on training runs until her lungs felt like sieves. She dropped into the brush, sprinted 10 meters and rolled into the road, brief, violent, decisive. A suppressed pistol in her hand. A quick double tap to the driver's head brought the truck to a graceless stop. She worked fast, methodical, no gratuitous cruelty, no theatrics. A man alive but unconscious. Restrain, search, secure, toss the keys. A second truck rolled up, its occupants confused, radio sputtering static. Alina didn't wait for them to organize. She moved like someone with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Two more shots, two more unconscious bodies. She bound them with zip ties and pushed them into the back of the first truck in a neat, ugly stack. It was clinical, necessary. Her hands trembled for a moment afterward, not from the adrenaline but from the gravity of what she'd made her hands do. She told herself the old, tired things people say in war. It was them or the town. It didn't make the motion any cleaner. She set traps, simple ones. Trip wires that would tangle boots and warn defenders. A string of crushed cans that would sing underfoot and tell of movement. A flare rig wired to a pressure plate to confuse and light the night if they came. Small things that would give the volunteers up in Timber Ridge seconds to breathe and prepare. Seconds was everything. Tommy Miller's crew moved like ghosts, men taking their positions under Alina's quiet instructions. They set up on porches, behind pilasters, in the diner kitchen that had once smelled only of gravy and coffee. Grace's hand shook when she passed Alina a cardboard box of canned beans for the men below. It was dignity in the form of food, making war less like war and more like the town's stubborn insistence on ordinary rituals. Alina walked a tight line between soldier and neighbor. She told herself she was neither wholly. That was the truth. She learned 1,000 times to hold both identities in a single breath, to be the woman who cooked pies in memory and the soldier who cut throats to keep other people's families whole. It was a contradiction she'd never resolved, but she lived with it because life had a way of asking people to be things they weren't built for. Back on the ridge, Reed's men stumbled into one of her traps. A flashlight tumbled, then a cascade of tin cans clattered like metal laughter. Shouts broke the night. Alina heard the snarls and the heavy boots as they tried to reorganize. Reed cursed into his radio and called for a sweep. He was methodical, steering men toward doors and porches where veterans waited with calm, steady aim. The first few seconds bled into minutes. Then the flare she'd rigged popped, a sudden bloom of flaming light. For a heartbeat, the world went white. The advantage went to the defenders. They moved with the confidence of people who had prepared and who knew their town. Old men who had argued in church basements now found their hands steady on veterans' rifles. Younger veterans breathed through the unfamiliar knot in their chests and remembered how to act. Alina watched from a side alley as they took calculated positions, as a rhythm and a structure formed from chaos. The town did not crumble. Kruger's men probed and tested, learning that Timber Ridge was not the soft target they'd expected. Their leader snarled orders at the periphery of Alina's vision, packing like a general who had been surprised by a trap he either misread or failed to predict. He was, by all reports and scars, a man who could make the world bend to his will. But he was vulnerable to the thing all such men underestimate: human stubbornness. People who refuse to vanish when told they must. The night's fight tasted of plywood and coffee grounds. A man fired from the diner window. A man cried out on Main Street. Alina's pulse thudded in her throat as she hustled from position to position, not to kill but to organize. Spotters here, restraint there, watch here. Her orders were precise and simple, anchored in a moral calculus she would not let others dictate. No civilian execution, no reprisals. If Kruger wanted a war, he would get it on terms that would not make innocents pay. Evenings like this always jangled something raw inside Alina. Questions she had no time to answer then, but which returned like tide. How much of yourself could you give away in service before you became someone else? How do you keep your hands clean when the world asks for blood? Her grandfather had told her that the rifle didn't define who she was. Her father had said the same in different words. Don't let the shape of the fight steal your soul. But here, in the dark, the hands were stained, and the soul felt like a thing she had to clutch with both palms. At some point in the night, the sheriff's name surfaced again. Mitchell, a local man who'd been seen talking to Kruger, who'd spent long hours with an easier smile when the militia had passed through. The betrayal hadn't been a rumor. It had been a hard fact Alina felt cut her like a physical wound. She'd seen the sheriff's truck at the mill earlier, the same truck that had thrown off men into the night, the same truck whose driver now sat gagged and bound under the cover of darkness. She thought of law, of oath, and felt the perverse irony thicken her chest. By the time first light diluted the sky into a threadbare gray, the last of Kruger's early probes pulled back from Main Street. They regrouped at the mill like wounded predators licking their wounds and reassessing. They would, Alina knew, change tactics. They would either try to burn the town outright, an act of terror meant to force her hand, or they would go quiet and wait for the FBI if the FBI ever truly came. Either way, the day ahead was long. Alina sat on the diner roof and watched the sunrise color the mountains like aftermath. Her hands were cold, her clothes soaked from the night's rain. There was blood on her gloves, some enemy, some lucky man who had not died thanks to a hurried tourniquet. It was there as proof that the night had happened, that choices had been made and consequences taken. She rummaged in her pack and found the small photograph she carried, a snapshot of her mother on a summer porch, smiling at something off camera. Emma's hair was longer than she remembered, and her eyes had that soft, fearless expression Alina associated with memory more than with fact. She'd never shown the photo to many. It was private, a shard of ordinary that steadied her when the extraordinary tried to consume her. She pressed it to her palm and inhaled. Coffee, rain, the leather tang of belts, life in concentrated detail. A soft voice behind her made her look up. Hayward had come down from the tower, his boots printing soft on the roof shingles. He stood a few feet away, just a man who had wanted to prove something earlier in the day and now had a smallness in him that showed the hours had reshaped him. "You did good," he said simply. No chest beating, no anthem, just a man saying the truth. It would echo in Alina's head later, the plainness of it. It meant more than parades. "Weren't you the one who told me to stay with the trucks this morning?" Alina asked, dry humor threading through her tiredness. He smiled, a small, wounded thing. "I was an idiot, you saved my men." She thought about the intimacy of that admission, the way it cut through the bristling ego of command. Power softened then, like metal cooled by water. Maps were spread across the tavern table later among coffee cups and a half-eaten pie. Hayward's team argued with the quiet ferocity of those who have to balance past mistakes with present danger. Alina listened more than she spoke, supplying detail when it mattered, retracting when the debate spiraled into ego. They planned not for glory but for survival. How to defend the fire tower if Kruger pushed a full assault. What to do if the convoy tried to take the southern road, where the FBI might try to land if they came in under cover of clouds. "Kruger's changing," Stone said at one point, fingers drumming. "He's not the same man who, if he's desperate enough, he'll escalate." Alina thought of the time when frustration is a crucible that tempers into something monstrous, revenge that forgets its original wound and instead feeds on itself. That was Kruger now, a man who'd let bitterness crystallize into purpose. She spent the mid-morning mapping out her next moves. More patrols, more small traps, more quiet warnings slipped under trusted doors. She checked radios, updated frequencies, and once more walked down toward Main Street to gauge the mood. The town moved like a living thing recalibrating, children staying inside, the church bell quiet, the diner's regulars learning to hold their breath between sips of coffee. Men like Kruger measured power in how many they could make kneel. People like Alina measured it differently, in who they could get home. It was a distinction that made little noise at first but whose consequences were hard as rock. By noon, a courier arrived on an ATV. "FBI in the area," the message said, ETA uncertain but moving. Hope lodged like a splinter in everyone's throats. For Alina, it was a thin armor, some protection, not salvation. The gray stretched before them, hours to go, choices to make, decisions that would define them in small, private ways. She folded her mother's photograph back into its pocket, tucked her hands into the hollows of her jacket, and stared toward the tree line where Kruger's men watched like a dark knot on the horizon. She had kept the town through the night by teaching people how to be brave. Now she had to make a choice about what kind of blow she would strike next, and whether the kind of justice she wanted existed outside the contour of the rifle's ring. She rose and walked toward the ridge, toward the tower, toward the men who had once laughed at her. The mountain wind pressed cold and honest against her face, like a hand reminding her she was still alive and still responsible. How do you carry a promise across a battlefield when the world keeps asking you to break it? Alina woke to the smell of coffee and wet ash, the town humming with a brittle calm that felt as fragile as the crust of a pie cooling on a diner windowsill. The night had been a small victory, boxes of rifles stacked behind the counter, veterans blinking into morning light, children kept away from windows. But dawn was never the same as absolution. It was a moment of inventory, what you had saved, what you had lost, and what debts still rode on your shoulders. She felt every one of those debts like a weight in her pack. The photograph of her mother, folded into its leather, was warm from the heat of her body. Her hands were raw where a strap had dug into her palm. Her uniform still smelled faintly of diesel and blood, a memory scent that clung like a second skin. She was proud of what they'd done, but there was a sharp, private edge under that pride. Pride that tasted of duty, and the kind of red fatigue that came after too many nights of being the only person who knew what needed to be done. A rumor had reached the tower before first light. Kruger had moved his main force back to the mill. He was consolidating. Perhaps he intended to lick his wounds, or perhaps he was simply gathering fuel for the next cruel bonfire. Either way, the temporary advantage Timber Ridge had bought could evaporate in an afternoon if they misread his patience for weakness. Hayward's team was tense in the small, steel cabin at the top of the tower. They moved like men who had once seen too much and had decided that motion was a kind of prayer. Maps lay spread across aluminum, coffee rings marking lines with the same randomness as bullet impacts. Alina sat apart, cleaning the barrel of her rifle with the slow, meditative motions that steadied her. The act was almost ritual, maintaining the instrument of her purpose, aligning parts as if by making them precise she could force the world to be precise as well. Stone kept glancing at her, his expression a cross between gratitude and a new, hard-won humility. "We hold for now," he said quietly, as if repetition might anchor the fragile plans. "Kruger, reorganizing. He'll test us again, but he's not going to burn the town if he's rational. That's not his style." "Rational is a dangerous hope in a man like him," Alina replied. She felt, in a particular way, like someone who'd been given a list of possible futures and had to choose which to make real. Each choice carried a moral weight: send men into certain exposure to save a building, call fire on a structure to stop an advance, let an armed man go to keep a crowd intact. These weren't easy mathematical problems. They were moral dilemmas wrapped in smoke. They spent the morning refining watch schedules, checking radio batteries, and quietly practicing drills so the townsfolk could move as one when it mattered. The act of teaching ordinary people how to be steady under fire left a residue in Alina's chest that felt like a forgiveness she hadn't earned. Teaching them to aim, to shift, to hold breath and watch for the shape of danger. Those were pieces of her life she placed into other hands like precious coins. It was intimate work, giving competence away, and she did it with the seriousness of a woman who knew the price. By midday, a scout returned from the tree line, breathless and pale. "They've moved," he reported. "3 vehicles, heavy, going south toward the county road. They're trying to flank to the highway." Alina listened, the word flank a harsh gust in her chest. She thought of the schoolhouse, the narrow road that funneled traffic like a throat, and the families who'd chosen to stay. She felt a hot, animal surge of protectiveness, a fierce, almost irrational desire to gather every ordinary person and sweep them into safety with her arms. But she also knew that stealing them away could be the very thing that made Kruger's plan succeed. Panic was a weapon he would use without a second thought. "Get a team on that highway," she said. "Block the approach, set traps, don't engage unless they push through civilian lines." Tommy Miller hammered out a response like a man who'd been waiting for a reason to move. He took volunteers, veterans and young men who had steadier hands in a crisis than many of the old-timers. Alina drew out a simple layout: ambush points at the overpass, tripwires where the underbrush thinned, and a fallback rally point at the church where civilians could be evacuated south if needed. She drew the lines with a finger, smoothing plans into the air like a cartographer of survival. The afternoon dissolved into a stew of noise and movement. Men at the diner sharpened knives and loaded magazines. The pastor drove a battered pickup around town, handing out radios and water. Grace Thompson refused to stop feeding people. She fed defenders and evacuees alike with the same fierce kindness. It felt almost obscene to be making such practical, brutal plans while someone inside the diner laughed and told a story about how her father used to fix the church bell. But ordinary life continued because ordinary people insisted on it, and because they understood that maintaining some sense of normal was a form of resilience that bullets couldn't take. Alina found herself moving between the world of plans and the world of human smallness, handing a bandage to a shivering kid, teaching an old soldier how to set an improvised bearing with a watch and the sun, then returning to the map to reroute an ambush point based on the latest scout report. Each physical motion stitched a moral seam. She could not, in good conscience, ask people to fight if she did not share the risk. So she stepped into the field with them when it mattered. When the convoy finally appeared at the bend, Alina was in place behind a collapsed stone wall with 2 young volunteers under her command. The road curved in slow surrender, and the sound of diesel filled the cup of shadow in front of her like a drum. Her heart thudded methodically, an athlete's rhythm, not fear. There was always fear, but it sat to the side, a tool she used rather than a master she obeyed. The first truck's headlamp sliced the dusk. Alina's hand rose, the old, clean motions that had been trained for decades. She squeezed the trigger on the suppressed rifle and felt the recoil like a soft, inevitable fact. The driver folded like a rag. A second shot and a man in the cab slumped. The world narrowed to breath and the muffled exhale of steel working. Then chaos erupted. Men in the convoy swore and returned fire. The night filled with light and answers, flash, sound, and the metallic thwack of ricochets into tree trunks. The volunteers performed with a calm that made Alina ache with a fierce, gentle pride. They pulled back to safety when the fight required it. They moved with care, escorting hidden families down the narrow secondary roads to safety, while a smaller strike team kept pressure on the convoy. The townspeople had become more than auxiliaries. They were the town's soul expressed in sticks and grit and rifle rounds. When the firefight dwindled and the convoy staggered away, wounded and cursing, the defenders let themselves breathe. The volunteers wiped grime from faces and checked magazines and shared small, human jokes to keep the vibration of adrenaline from coagulating into terror. Alina sat with her back against cold stone and let the evening wash over her like rainwater. She felt a fatigue that was not purely physical. Some part of her was eroding under the constant ledger of decisions. She began to think, without wanting to, about the shape of vengeance, about Vincent Kruger and his slow, patient cruelty. He had crafted a deliberate moral gambit: tie her to a past she didn't always want to wear, force her to choose between killing and protecting, and then watch the cycle of violence calcify into ritual. He was, she realized, an artisan of cruelty. Men like him rationalize horror, reasoning that the end absolves the means. But Alina had no taste for such absolution. Her grandfather had testified, yes, but his testimony aimed to stop abuses, not to create martyrs. She had not come to Timber Ridge to be anything other than a safeguard. That thought led to a different, darker reflection. What made a man like Kruger believe that he could rebuild himself through the destruction of others? The question had no quick answer, only a slow, troubling procession of glimpses. Men broken by war who then sought to make others suffer as a distorted proof that their pain wasn't meaningless. It was a poisonous logic. Everything about him suggested a man whose internal ledger had been corrupted, until the only way to balance it was to wreak imbalance on others. The radio clicked. Hayward's voice was practical and brief. We've got movement on the mill road. They're consolidating again. Expect harassment tonight. Stone's reply was short and steady. We'll hold. Timber Ridge has held. We'll make a stand to the last man if we must. Alina let the words settle. We'll hold. The phrase carried weight like a promise made in a church. She repeated it to herself like prayer, then added her own quiet amendment, and lived to see the next day. Survival was the small, stubborn hope that worked like a salve. When the night arrived, it came in slow, patient waves. The town was quieter now, a cautious hush. People moved in small lines, not in crowds, carrying blankets and the few important things they would not leave behind. Alina walked the streets, a silent sentinel in the gray light of street lamps. She checked on the old-timers in their chairs, on children pressed under quilts, on the volunteer teams who'd taken the long, jagged positions around the perimeter. Each face she saw was a testament to a fragile courage that did not ask for recognition. At some point on her rounds, she stopped outside the diner. Grace stood at the window, hands clasped, watching the town. The old woman turned and smiled at Alina like the map of a lifetime. "You did good, child," she said without ceremony. It was the truest praise Alina had heard in days. The sound lodged in her chest like a coin. They spoke quietly for a while. Grace told a story about a time a storm once flooded the valley and the town had gathered on a hill and sang until dawn. "We didn't save the barn," Grace admitted with a small shrug, "but we saved the songs." It was a ridiculous thing to say in a war, and yet it felt like the moral center of everything. There were things you could lose and still remain whole. There were things you could not surrender without losing yourself. Food, shelter, safety, these were important. But the songs, the quiet human rituals, the coffee at dawn, those were the lines that demarcated what it meant to be human instead of merely surviving. Alina thought of her mother's laugh, and of the way cooking smells had once filled their house. She realized with a sudden, painful clarity that the life she was defending was not just a collection of roofs and roads. It was the daily, ordinary warmth that made existence tolerable. That realization hardened her resolve in a way that felt almost tender. Protecting Timber Ridge meant protecting the small, human acts that made life worth continuing. She slipped away from Grace's window and returned to the tower to find Hayward leaning against the railing, staring into the dark like a man trying to read a map written in smoke. He looked up and met her eyes, and for a moment words were unnecessary. They had both lost something tonight, their innocence, perhaps, or the complacent certainty that plans always worked. "Tomorrow," he said finally, as if speaking into the night, "we make a choice. Do we chase him and risk the people, or do we tighten the noose and let the law catch up?" Alina considered his question. There was no right answer, only a series of calculations that had both moral and mortal consequences. The law was slow, and men like Kruger used time as a weapon, but chasing him recklessly could shred the town she'd fought so hard to protect. "We make the next right move," she said finally. "We don't let anger make decisions for us. We hold our lines, keep people safe, and when we have to act, we act clean, surgical, certain. No rage-driven stunts. We don't become what he is." Hayward nodded, absorbing the truth like a compact to live by. There was a resolution in that moment that felt like an oath made between two soldiers and a town. When she finally collapsed into a thin cot in the small tower cabin, exhaustion took her with a physicality that felt like forgiveness. She slept in fits, dreams threaded with her grandfather's voice, her father's silhouette on a ridge, and the soft face of her mother in a photograph. Each image braided into the next, blending memory and duty into a single, persistent narrative. You do what must be done, and you keep the soul of what you save intact. Outside, Kruger's men stirred and resorted like waves testing a shoreline. Inside, the town breathed, fragile and alive. Alina slept and dreamed of songs and kitchens. She woke to the same heavy, honest sky, feeling the moral ledger inside her loosen by the smallest degree, enough to let hope breathe, and enough to keep her hands steady for the decisions that would come. Sometimes, she thought as she strapped into her rifle harness and readied for the day, saving people meant keeping them ordinary. And ordinary was worth everything. What would you sacrifice to keep strangers safe? And how many times could you make that choice before it hollowed you out? Alina woke to gray light. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked iron, the kind of mountain dawn that blurred edges between peace and aftermath. She slept maybe an hour, but her body no longer bothered with protests. It had learned the rhythm of crisis. Rest when you can, move when you must. She sat up, the cot creaking under her, and for a few seconds just listened. To the wind clawing at the tower frame, the murmur of radios below, the muted stir of the town reassembling itself after a night of vigilance. The SEAL team was already at work, voices low. Hayward leaned over a map with Stone, Martinez, and Park, tracing the valley routes with blunt pencils. There was no arrogance in his tone anymore, only the pragmatic humility of a man who understood the math of survival. When he looked up at Alina, there was respect in his eyes, quiet, matter of fact, earned through fire. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," she replied, fastening her jacket. "Status." "Timber Ridge is holding," he said. "We've got eyes on the mill, minimal movement since last night. Either Kruger's licking his wounds or setting up something big." "He doesn't lick wounds," Alina said. "He reopens them in other people." Stone frowned. "Then he'll strike soon." She nodded. "Before the feds arrive. He knows once they get close, his window closes." Hayward's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure he hits a wall when he tries." Alina stepped onto the platform, looking down over the valley. The mist lay thick, curling through the trees like breath. For a moment it looked peaceful, but she knew better. Somewhere out there, men were moving, calculating, angry, unpredictable. And in the center of that storm was Kruger, patient, intelligent, burning with grievance. She checked her rifle and scanned the far ridge through her scope. The forest was still, but not empty. Stillness was never safety. It was intent waiting for movement. Hayward joined her. "You think he'll come for you directly?" "He'll come for anyone I protect," she said quietly. "He always did believe in poetic revenge." Hayward tilted his head, studying her. "You've faced him before." "Indirectly," she said. "He came after my grandfather through silence. Letters, threats, rumors, the kind of cruelty that leaves no record. When that didn't work, he vanished. I was a kid. I thought monsters stayed gone if you ignored them long enough. And now I know monsters wait for dark skis." They stood side by side, two soldiers bound not by rank but by understanding. The kind born from seeing the worst in people and still choosing to guard what was left of the good. Below them the radio squawked to life. "Contact East Ridge." Martinez's voice, urgent, controlled. Alina dropped to her scope in one motion. Three figures in mottled camouflage advancing through the fog, rifles raised. Scouts, probing, testing defenses. "Three hostiles east," she confirmed. "Spacing 15 meters, likely recon." "Non-lethal if possible," Hayward said. "We need intel." Alina steadied her rifle. The first man moved into a clearing, glancing left, military bearing, not malicious sloppiness. She fired once, low, hitting the leg just below the knee. The man crumpled silently. The other two froze, then scattered, one left, one right. She tracked them but didn't shoot. Sometimes you learn more from who runs than who fights. Hayward and Stone moved fast, descending the tower with two of the locals to intercept. Minutes later, their voices crackled back over comms. "Got him. Alive. Looks trained. Not local militia." Alina's stomach tightened. Then Kruger's pulling from somewhere else. The prisoner confirmed it later, under the quiet weight of truth and exhaustion. Mercenaries, ex-military, hired through a shadow network of contractors Kruger had been building for years. The ambush wasn't a rogue act anymore. It was a campaign. The forest was no longer just a trap. It was a testing ground. "He's moving on multiple fronts," Alina said after the debrief. "This isn't about revenge anymore. He's building something bigger. Maybe a statement, maybe leverage. Hayward looked grim. You think this is a recruitment play, tear or sell? She shook her head. No, Kruger doesn't share ideology. He sells it. He's using revenge as branding. He wants to show the world that the old ghosts are still alive and that he can make the government bleed in its own backyard. The team fell silent. The weight of her words was too big to carry easily. Alina felt the moral gravity pressing down again. This wasn't just about Timber Ridge anymore. It was about what would come after if Kruger succeeded. Every death here would feed his myth, justify his sickness, turn pain into propaganda. She turned toward the map on the table. We need to end this before he gets another headline. Hayward met her gaze. Meaning we take the fight to him. Silence, then Stone said, You're talking about assaulting the mill. Alina nodded. Before he has time to reset, while he's expecting us to hunker down. Martinez exhaled. That's suicide with our numbers. Maybe, she said, but sitting here waiting to be surrounded is slower suicide. Hayward paced, thinking the kind of thinking that didn't make noise but rearranged the air. Finally, he stopped. All right, we plan it clean, surgical. If we go quiet. The decision hung in the air like a verdict. Alina moved away from the table, stepping outside again. The fog had thickened. The forest below looked like a sea. She thought of Timber Ridge, the diner, the laughter, the songs Grace had told her about. She thought of her mother, her father, her grandfather. Every one of them had taught her something about standing her ground, but none had warned her how lonely that stance could become. She felt the ache of fatigue rise in her chest like an old injury. Her reflection on the tower glass stared back, mud-streaked face, eyes too old for the body that carried them. A soldier, a ghost, a daughter, a human being walking a knife's edge between duty and despair. That's when the radio crackled again. A different voice this time, calm, familiar, Kruger. Vance, he said, you're still alive. I should be impressed, but I'm not. You've cost me good men. That debt needs paying. Alina didn't answer. I've been watching you, Kruger continued. You could have left that town, let it burn. You could have run, but you stayed. Noble, stupid. I'll give you a choice, same as I gave your grandfather once. Surrender yourself and the civilians live. Or keep hiding and I make sure every roof in that valley glows red before the hour's out. Hayward stepped forward. We ignore it, he whispered. But Alina was staring at the horizon. The fog was moving wrong, thicker in one area, rising faster. She lifted her binoculars, and her stomach turned to ice. Smoke, she said. South Ridge, he's already started. The town. They ran. Down the stairs, through the wet brush, the radio filling with panic, voices calling in from Timber Ridge, Grace's voice breaking through the static. Fire on the south end. They're pushing civilians toward the square. By the time Alina reached the ridge overlook, the valley was alive with chaos. Trucks barreled down Main Street, gunfire echoing against the church bell. Civilians scrambled toward the old school. The diner was burning, orange flame licking the roof like some twisted banner. Her heart clenched. This isn't an attack, she said, voice shaking with fury. It's punishment. Hayward's voice hardened. Then we end it now. He gave the order and the team mobilized. 2 squads split, one toward the town, one toward the mill. Alina stayed with Hayward's group, racing down the slope into Timber Ridge. The air was a wall of smoke and sound, crackling wood, screaming metal, the dull percussion of gunfire. She moved through it like a blade through water, sighting targets, covering civilians, coordinating evacuation. Every face she saw burned itself into her memory. The teenage boy carrying his sister, the old pastor bleeding from the shoulder but still guiding people toward safety. Grace, still there, still at the diner, dragging out a propane tank to keep the fire from reaching the fuel line. Alina reached her in time to help. They rolled the tank away together, collapsing behind a truck as a bullet snapped through the air. Grace smiled, tired, defiant. Told you I wasn't leaving, she said, coughing through the smoke. Elena gripped her hand. I know. Then the explosion came, a concussive roar from the mill side of the valley. A plume of fire rose, towering, lighting the sky. Kruger's final move, maybe. A scorched earth. A message to anyone who thought they could stop him. The radio sputtered again, Stone's voice, broken and urgent. Multiple detonations at the mill. Secondary explosions. We've got casualties. Elena's breath caught. Pull back, Stone, get clear. But beneath the noise, another voice broke through the static. Kruger's, ragged but triumphant. You took my name once, Vance. Now I take yours. A shot cracked across the valley. Then silence. Hayward grabbed the mic. Vance, we've lost comms with Stone. We can't reach the mill. Elena's mind was already ahead of him. He's there, she said. Kruger still alive. Then what are you? She was already moving. Down the burning street, through the smoke, past faces shouting her name. The rifle in her hands felt lighter than it should have. Every step was both memory and momentum. She didn't know if it was vengeance or duty that drove her now. Maybe it didn't matter. At the edge of town, she stopped, looking back once. Grace was helping the wounded, the church bell was still standing, and the people, her people now, were fighting back, protecting each other. For the first time since the mission began, Timber Ridge wasn't afraid. Elena turned back toward the ridge. I'm ending this, she whispered, and began the long climb toward the burning mill. Rain started to fall again, thin, steady, merciful. She didn't look back. What did revenge ever build except ruins? The rain had gone from a mist to a curtain by the time Elena reached the mill road again. The fire that had once glared against the sky was dying, smoke hanging low in thick, oily ropes. Her boots sank into mud slick with ash. She could taste metal and soot in every breath. The air itself felt heavy with endings. She crouched behind a fallen signpost, Timber Mill, ESD. 1939, half buried in gravel and blood. Around her, the bodies of Kruger's men lay where the explosions had tossed them. Some still moved faintly, groaning through burns and broken bones. She moved among them silently, checking for threats, for traps. One man tried to reach for his weapon. She kicked it away and shook her head. You don't want to do that, she said softly. He froze. She left him breathing. The mill was a cathedral of wreckage. Twisted iron, shattered glass, the smell of charred oil and timber. Rain hissed on metal. Somewhere deep inside, a generator hummed unevenly, sputtering power into a few surviving floodlights that flickered like dying stars. Her steps echoed as she entered the main hall, rifle up, every sense stretched thin. The air vibrated with faint static, the sound of a radio half alive, and beneath it a voice, calm and deliberate. I was wondering how long it would take you. Vincent Kruger stepped out of the shadows. He was older than the photograph she'd seen in her grandfather's records, gray in the beard, lines etched deep, but the eyes were the same. Cold, calculating, a man who'd mistaken control for redemption. He held his weapon low, not as a threat, but as punctuation to his words. You look like him, he said. Samuel Vance, always the same moral stare, always believing you're saving something. Elena kept her rifle steady. I'm not here to debate salvation. No, Kruger said. You're here to finish a story you didn't write. He gestured toward the burning debris, toward the men he'd once commanded. You think this is my doing alone? Your grandfather started this when he testified. He took everything from me, my name, my honor, my brothers. He told the world I was a monster. You executed civilians, Elena said quietly. He smiled, not in defense but in recognition. War does strange things to honor. We did what the mission required. And then what? You decided to make that mission your religion. Kruger tilted his head. Tell me, Sergeant, what separates you from me tonight? You've killed men, too. You've set traps, made war in the name of mercy. You think the mountain cares whose hands hold the rifle. Elena took a slow breath. The difference is what happens after the trigger's pulled. You use death to feed your anger. I use it to stop the next one." "Spoken like a good soldier," Kruger murmured. "The kind the world eats alive." He took a step closer, rain dripping from his coat. "You could have been mine, you know, not literally but in purpose. You understand precision, patience, cause, and effect. You just lack conviction." "I have conviction," she said. "That's why I'm still standing." He laughed then, a dry, brittle sound that echoed through the hollow of the mill. "You think you're standing on moral ground, but all I see is a child trying to prove her family was right." She didn't answer. Instead, she moved slightly to her left, lining him up against the light spilling through the broken roof. The faint glow caught the edges of his face, making his eyes gleam like an animal. "You burned a town," she said. "You killed civilians again, and you think it's about legacy." He shrugged. "Legacy is just a word we use to justify pain." For a moment neither moved. Only the sound of rain through the holes in the roof, dripping onto the warped floorboards. Then Kruger's voice softened. "You know what your grandfather told me the day he testified," he said. "A man's worth isn't measured by the wars he wins, but by the ones he refuses to fight." I laughed at him then, but now I see what he meant. He raised his weapon slightly, eyes cold. "Some wars don't end until someone stops refusing." The muzzle lifted. Elena fired first. The recoil kicked through her shoulder like thunder. Kruger staggered back, hit high in the chest, but didn't fall. He stumbled against a beam, blood mixing with rain on his jacket. His weapon dropped to the floor with a dull clatter. He laughed again, softer this time. "So that's it. The Vance line finally finishes what it started." She kept her rifle trained on him. "It's not about bloodlines. It's about ending the damage you keep spreading." Kruger's knees gave way. He slid down the beam, breath shallow, the light in his eyes flickering. "You think killing me ends it. You think the men who followed me did it for me. They did it for the idea that someone finally stood against hypocrisy." "Hypocrisy doesn't justify murder," she said. He smiled faintly. "Tell that to your country." She almost fired again. Almost. But then she saw what her grandfather must have seen all those years ago, a man hollowed out by his own self-justification, a man who had replaced remorse with ideology until he couldn't tell the difference. She lowered her rifle. Kruger noticed, smirking. "Softness," he whispered. "That's the real inheritance." "No," she said quietly, "it's conscience." He coughed, blood on his lips, and then, almost gently, "You're a fool, girl." "Maybe," she said, "but the kind the world still needs." His head sagged forward. The breath left him like a sigh. She waited a long time before she moved, watching the rise and fall of his chest until it stopped entirely. Then she walked forward and closed his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. It was duty, the same kind her grandfather had shown when he'd written his final report on Kruger's crimes. Someone had to end it. Someone had to mark the last line. Outside, thunder rolled through the valley, and for a brief moment she thought it was artillery. Old reflexes, old ghosts. She radioed in. "Recon actual, this is Vance. Objective neutralized, mill secured." Static, then Hayward's voice, thin and cracked. "Copy Overwatch, confirm Kruger." "Confirmed," she said. "It's over." "Not yet," Hayward replied. "We've got wounded in the south sector. Fire's spreading. We need you back." She looked around the mill one last time. The wreckage, the bodies, the rain. Then she slung her rifle, exhaled, and began the long walk back down the mountain. The descent felt different this time. The trees no longer whispered threats. They whispered release. Every step carried a strange lightness, as if she were returning something borrowed. The forest that had once been a battlefield was just forest again. When she reached Timber Ridge, dawn had broken through the smoke. The town still stood, scarred but alive. The diner was a blackened shell, but the church bell still hung in its tower, cracked yet whole. People moved through the streets, tending to the wounded, clearing debris. Survival, she realized, was its own quiet defiance. Grace found her first, bandaged arm in a sling, face streaked with soot but smiling. "Is it done?" she asked. Elena nodded. "It's done." The old woman studied her a moment. "And you?" Elena hesitated. "I'm still standing." Grace touched her arm, gentle. "That's enough." Later in the Church-turned-field hospital, Hayward met her at the door. His uniform was singed, his expression exhausted. "You finished it," he said simply. "We all did," she replied. He nodded, glancing toward the ridge where smoke still curled. "Command will send questions, reports. They'll want to make sense of it." "They won't," she said. "They'll file it under containment success and move on." "Maybe," Hayward said, "but the people here, they'll remember." Elena looked out over the town. Children carrying buckets, an old man hanging a flag on a cracked pole, Grace sweeping ash from her porch. "They don't need to remember me," she said, "just what they were capable of." Hayward's voice softened. "You're leaving, aren't you?" She nodded. "There's cleanup paperwork, but after that, yeah, I'm not good at staying." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what makes you good at what you do." She didn't answer. The truth was, she didn't know what she was good at anymore. Killing had never been the point. Protecting had been, but even that came with ghosts. Before she left, she walked one last time through the ruins of the diner. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet ash. She found Grace's old coffee pot bent, blackened, but intact. She cleaned it in a puddle, set it on the counter, and smiled. Some things, even burned, still had purpose. As she turned to leave, a child's voice called from the doorway. "Ma'am, is the bad man gone?" Elena looked down. The boy couldn't have been more than 8. Eyes wide, face smudged with soot. "He's gone," she said gently. "Are you leaving too?" She crouched, meeting his gaze. "For a while, but you've got good people here. Brave ones, you'll be fine." He thought about that, then nodded solemnly. "I'll help rebuild the diner." She smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd managed in days. "Then you'll be doing something important." He grinned back, small and proud. When she finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of cedar and smoke and something faintly sweet, hope maybe, or just the absence of fear. She looked up at the mountain one last time. The same ridge her grandfather had once hunted on, the same valley where her father had learned to walk again, the same ground that had taught her how to aim, and more importantly, when not to. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Grandpa, it's done." No thunder answered this time. Just the wind through the trees and the distant sound of hammers rebuilding what had been broken. She turned toward the road, shoulders heavy but heart lighter than it had been in years. Sometimes, she thought, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. How do you live after the fight stops, when everything inside you still sounds like war? The question found Elena before sunrise, whispered between the hush of wind and the soft creak of her gear as she packed. Timber Ridge still slept under a thin quilt of fog. The mountains loomed silent, their edges blue and gray, softened by distance and the mercy of early light. She stood at the edge of town with her rifle slung low, watching the first orange hint of dawn catch on the wet rooftops. The fires had been out for a day, but the smell of smoke lingered like memory, unwilling to let go. Her body ached from exhaustion. Cuts, bruises, and the dull, bruised throb that came from too many hours of adrenaline. She carried all of it with a soldier's acceptance. The kind that didn't complain because pain meant she was still alive. The kind that understood survival wasn't healing. It was just the first step toward it. She had told Hayward she would stay until the last evac was processed, until every civilian had what they needed. She'd kept that promise. Now there was nothing left to oversee, nothing left to shoot at, no radio chatter waiting for her voice. Only quiet. Quiet, she'd learned, could be more dangerous than gunfire. The field hospital had been moved into the schoolhouse. Rows of cots lined the gym floor, the air thick with disinfectant and tired gratitude. Elena moved through them softly, checking faces, leaving small words behind. Grace Thompson was sitting up, arms still in a sling, her sharp humor intact. When she saw Alina, her eyes warmed with recognition. "You look like you could use breakfast, child." Alina smiled faintly. "You're supposed to be resting." "I rest when I'm dead, coffee." "Only if it's not from that burned pot," Alina said, and for a moment they both laughed, thin, real, needed. Grace reached for her hand. "You did what no one else could have done. Don't argue with it, just know it mattered." Alina squeezed back, but her reply was quiet. "I just didn't want anyone else to pay for his ghosts." "Maybe that's what makes you different," Grace said. "You carry ghosts, but you don't feed them." The words sat heavy in Alina's chest, soft and true. She thought of her grandfather, his silence, his guilt, his lessons carved into her bones. Of her father, his limp, his stubborn pride, his refusal to surrender. And of Kruger, his rage, his blindness, his final breath echoing through the ruins of the mill. 3 men, 3 versions of what war could make you. She was still trying to decide which one she'd become. By midday, Hayward found her outside the church, where she sat on the steps cleaning her rifle one last time. He looked worn, uniform scorched, but alive. There was a softness in his face that hadn't been there before, a man no longer performing command, just existing in its shadow. "You heading out?" he asked. "Soon," she said. "Command wants debrief in Charleston. After that, who knows?" He nodded. "You could join us officially. SEAL liaison, Overwatch consultant. We could use someone who can see what others miss." She looked up at him, sunlight catching on the edge of her hair. "And do this all over again." Hayward hesitated. "Maybe not this, but something like it." She smiled, sad, patient. "I think the world has enough soldiers. It just needs more people who remember what they're fighting for." He exhaled through his nose, half a laugh, half a sigh. "You're not wrong." She stood, slinging the rifle onto her back. "Keep the town safe until the feds finish cleanup. And Hayward, thank you for listening." "Wouldn't have survived without you," he said simply. They shook hands, no salutes, no ceremony. Just acknowledgement. Then she walked past him, her boots clicking softly against the wet pavement. The drive out of Timber Ridge was long and winding, the road bordered by the same pine and oak her grandfather once hunted beneath. She stopped halfway up the ridge at an overlook that faced the valley. Below her, the town looked small and stubborn, smoke curling from chimneys, the bell tower gleaming faintly in the morning light. Rebuilding had already begun. That was how you beat destruction. You outlived it. She sat on the hood of her truck, opened her canteen, and let her thoughts unspool. The army would write this up as a contained insurgent threat. The reports would sanitize it. No mention of Grace's courage, or the diner's fall, or the child who wanted to rebuild. They would call Kruger's death an operational success. They wouldn't mention the smell of rain on ash, or how her hands still shook when the world went quiet. Paperwork was a kind of mercy. It hid the human cost beneath statistics. But Alina knew. She always would. She took the photo from her jacket pocket, her mother's smile, worn soft from years of folding and unfolding. "It's over," she whispered. "We did what we had to." A single raindrop hit the corner of the photo. She didn't bother wiping it away. For a long while she sat there, watching the valley breathe, until the sound of tires on gravel broke her reverie. A truck rolled up behind her, Tommy Miller in the driver's seat, waving through the window. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, climbing out. "Grace told me you were planning to ghost out." Alina smirked. "I was trying to." He handed her a thermos. Coffee, real, not the powdered stuff. She took it gratefully. "You didn't have to." "I owed you, we all do." She shook her head. "You owe yourselves, you fought for your town. I just reminded you you could." Tommy looked out at the valley beside her. "We'll rebuild. Might take years, but we'll do it. Some of us needed a reminder of what we still had." They stood there for a while in companionable silence, watching sunlight touch the ridge. When he finally turned back to his truck, he paused. "You ever come back through, there'll be coffee waiting. and a seat by the window. She smiled. "I'll hold you to that." When his truck disappeared down the road, she climbed back into hers. For a few seconds, she just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, listening to the engine idle. Then she started driving. The highway unwound before her like a scar across the land. She passed forests, fields, rivers swollen from rain. The world beyond Timber Ridge looked the same as it always had, unaware of the fire that had almost swallowed one small town whole. That was the strange mercy of the world. It moved on, indifferent but constant, giving people the chance to begin again. As miles passed, her thoughts quieted. The mission no longer replayed behind her eyes. The gunfire, the screams, the decisions, they'd all receded into something else. Not peace exactly, more like understanding. She stopped once more near a roadside rest where the air smelled of wet grass and diesel. A boy was sitting with his father at a picnic table, eating sandwiches, laughing. The sound caught her off guard, a laugh too pure to exist near battlefields. It reminded her of the child in the diner, the one who said he'd rebuild. She found herself smiling. Maybe that's what redemption was, not grand gestures or medals or apologies. Just small, ordinary laughter that refused to die. She sat on the bench for a while, eyes closed, letting the sun touch her face. The warmth felt undeserved but real. That was enough. When she reached Charleston that evening, the debrief went as expected. Hours of questions, signatures, phrases like minimal collateral damage and containment achieved. She answered what she could, omitted what didn't belong to them. When it was done, she walked out of the gray concrete building and didn't look back. Her truck waited in the lot, still caked in mud. She climbed in, started the engine, and drove west. No destination, just direction. Night came again, soft and unhurried. The stars were sharp, clear through the windshield. She thought of her grandfather then, not the soldier, not the witness, but the man who once told her under a sky like this, "The hardest part of a sniper's life isn't the waiting, it's what comes after. Learning how to see the world through a scope and still find beauty with your own eyes." She smiled faintly. For the first time in years she did see it, the way moonlight cut through branches, the silver of rivers, the curve of distant hills. Beautiful, fragile, alive. She drove until exhaustion told her to stop. Then she pulled onto a quiet overlook, killed the engine, and sat in silence. The world below was asleep, unaware that a war had ended on its edge. She could almost hear the hum of life returning, crickets, wind, the faint sigh of trees. She thought about calling her father. Maybe she would, maybe not tonight. Some things needed silence before they found words. She closed her eyes, leaning back against the seat, the sound of rain beginning again. Gentle this time, forgiving. For the first time in months, she wasn't waiting for the next shot. And in that stillness, a truth surfaced, quiet and whole. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't always charge hills or break doors. Sometimes, courage is staying when leaving would be easier. Sometimes, it's walking away when vengeance would feel better. And sometimes, it's rebuilding a diner in a town the world forgot. Alina let that thought rest in her chest like a heartbeat. Morning would come again as it always did. And when it did, she would start over, without medals, without applause, without certainty. Just another face among strangers, carrying ghosts, keeping promises, and remembering the songs Grace had talked about. Because in the end, she understood what her grandfather had meant all those years ago. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.